Morning, everyone. For those of you who are just joining us, I think maybe we should go ahead and get started. What do you think, Byron, since we have a relatively short program planned? All right, so welcome and thank you everyone for joining us this morning for Coffee with the Collection. My name is Amanda and I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. Before we get started, let's go over a little housekeeping first. Everyone should be on mute right now, and we'd like to ask you all to keep yourselves muted so that we can all hear our presenter without any distractions. But if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to do so using the chat feature. To open your chat, scroll down to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on the icon that looks a little like a speech bubble. And it should also say chat underneath that. Once you click that, a window will open to the side of your screen where you'll be able to type questions and comments, and we'll circle back around to those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today, Byron Price, who will be discussing Frederic Remington's Bronco Buster. To give you a little background information about Byron, he is our current interim director of the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. He holds the Charles M. Russell Memorial Chair and is director of the Charles M. Russell Center for the Study of Art of the American West at the University of Oklahoma. From 2007 to 2018, he also served as director of the University of Oklahoma Press. And before arriving at OU, Byron served as executive director of the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum in Canyon, Texas, the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City, and the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming. That's quite a mouthful. So I'd like to invite everyone to sit back, relax, grab your cup of coffee. Hopefully you have with you the Remington roast made available especially for this program by our friends at the Black Camel Coffee. But actually, kind of before I hand this over to Byron, what I'd like to do first is to start by asking everyone a question. And you can answer that using the chat. So my question for you is, for those of you all who are familiar with Remington's work, do you think of him primarily as a painter or as a sculptor? Go ahead and put your answer in the chat there. Both, nice. Mostly sculpture. I'm partial to sculpting, but like both. Very nice. Sort of looks like an even mix. Byron, what do you think?
Looks like an intelligent audience.
Well, thank you so much for your answers, everyone. Byron, I'm going to go ahead and hand this on over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda. It's a pleasure to be here this morning and to discuss a sculpture in the collection, which is actually a loan to the collection, but which is an important work that's currently on exhibit at the in the Atkins Collection Gallery on the second floor of the museum. I wanted to talk a little bit about and frame Remington's Bronco Buster in the larger subject of equestrian sculpture and its traditions in the United States and in Europe, and talk a little bit about how Frederic Remington fits in with that. Horses were artist Frederic Remington's lifelong passion. They inhabited many of his paintings and sculpture, and here you see the man who did not lack for self-confidence, and we'll see that more in a moment. He was the most celebrated and prolific American equine and equestrian artist of his day, which is a mouthful. He considered the oft-repeated adage he knew the horse to be a worthy epitaph. And it wasn't really an exaggeration. He did know the horse. In his short 48 years of life, he observed, drew, painted, and sculpted thousands of equines of every breed and station. Although the artist's stirring portrayals of horses in action sometimes called into question the impact of photography on his work, among late 19th century American artists at least, his equine images were in a class by themselves, and were the standard by which other horse painters and later sculptors would be judged. Remington was an accomplished horseman himself. He believed, as he told one interviewer, quote, "No one can draw equestrian subjects unless he is an equestrian himself," close quote. But whether he really rode like a Comanche, as one pundit asserted, is perhaps debatable. He acknowledged being bucked off more than once. Surviving photographs like the one on the screen of the artist astride a hornless saddle in a business suit and a bowler hat also belied his public persona as a hard-riding cowboy, a facade he consciously promoted in his books, his articles, correspondence, and an 1890 equestrian self-portrait that's shown here, where he portrays himself on the white horse, as any good hero would of the day. His reputation as an illustrator of Western American subject matter also overshadowed the numerous Eastern and foreign-bred horses and riders that Remington drew and painted over the course of his career. And here you see some of the less Western subject matter, maybe Western Morocco, but also a photograph of an Arab horseman that he actually took himself when he was in Morocco in the late 19th century. And these are some of the foreign-bred horses and riders that he drew and painted over the course of his career, particularly military subjects. He did a series of cavalry figures featuring the European horses and riders. He actually visited the facilities where the horses were raised and bred in Germany and in Russia, and was provided American readers with some of their only contacts with these kinds of figures. To Frederic Remington, no horseman on earth compared to those of his home country, however, and for fearlessness, none surpassed the Rough Riders, cowboys of the American West. In 1888, his first published drawing of a bucking horse and rider, which is shown in this slide, appeared as an illustration for an article by Theodore Roosevelt in the Century magazine, and later in Roosevelt's 1888 book, Ranch Life and the Hunting Trail, whose text proclaimed that cowboys were, in his heroic American type, quote, "as hardy and self-reliant as men who ever breathed," close quote. Over the years, Remington depicted many types of riders and bucking horses, not all of them Western. They included a Philadelphia polo horse, Australian hunter jumpers, and others, for example. It is not surprising, perhaps, that Remington chose to depict a horse aboard a rearing bucker in his first sculpture in 1895. But this was not the first cowboy figure to be sculpted. That honor belonged to Alexander Fimster Proctor, who produced a cowboy figure for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, shown here. Proctor's plaster equestrian who tugs on the bridle reins to stop his horse attracted the enmity of cowboys performing with Buffalo Bill's Wild West, just outside the fairgrounds. They hated this sculpture and resolved to throw it in the nearby lagoon at the and which would have created quite a stir, since this was a life-size plaster image. Would have been very difficult to do, but they felt it necessary to preserve their idea of what real horsemanship and real cowboys and horses did. William F. Buffalo Bill Cody, however, is said to have exposed and diffused the plot before it could be carried out. And so Proctor's cowboy and horse continued to ride in Chicago in the early 1890s. Adapting a pose and details that he had used in previous illustrations, like the pitching bronco, the puncher, and mounting a wild one, shown here, the artist began modeling a rearing horse and rider in a powerful cantilevered form based on that cantilevered form was anchored to the base of the animal's rear legs, which you can see here in this photograph, an early image of Remington working on his initial Bronco Buster model. Remington's decision to model his Bronco Buster and horse as his first subject was a challenging one. Rather than position the sculptural group horizontally, as his friend Frederic Ruckstall, a fellow artist and sculptor, had suggested, he decided on a vertical arrangement, which posed obvious structural problems, especially considering Remington's lack of previous modeling experience. This is really his first sculpture, his first effort at 3 dimensions. Although he made little progress at first, he did recognize the permanence of bronze sculpture compared to paint, and wrote his friend Owen Wister, quote, "My oils will all get old. They will look like pale molasses in time. My watercolors will fade, but I am to endure in bronze." He was stymied for months, however, in finding a way to support horse and rider on the rear legs of the horse only, without resorting to what was called a Grecian post, which was a classical way of handling such problems. And here you see this monument, equestrian monument at Gettysburg, which has a giant tree trunk that goes up into the barrel of the horse as a way of supporting the weight. And this horse is on 4 legs, not 2. So you can see the issues that Remington was facing. He consulted several sculptors on the issue, and all suggested some sort of external supporting mechanism. At one point, Remington considered giving up, but he was re-energized when Frederic Ruckstall set up a studio in the backyard of Remington's neighbor, August Thomas, who was a playwright. And he used this makeshift studio in the backyard of the Remington's neighbor to construct the clay model for this equestrian bronze of General John Frederick Hantraft, who was another of the heroes of Gettysburg, which had been commissioned by Pennsylvania for the state capitol in Harrisburg. Remington became a regular visitor at Ruckstall's New Rochelle studio and watched the process of creating this monument from beginning to end. He was especially interested in the creation of the horse that carried Handcraft and argued its merits compared to the Mustang that would be ridden by Remington's Bronco Buster. In time, Remington was able to solve the problems of balance in his sculpture by making a large armature, some 24 inches, and adopting a more vertical posture for the horse and rider, who in an early maquette was depicted with his hat off in the hand of the Bronco Buster, who was what was called fanning the horse, which was going back and forth with his hat, spanking the horse on the flank at every jump. As his model neared completion, Remington selected the Henri Bonnard foundry in New York City for the job of casting the sculpture, in large measure because of the Bonnard's reputation for solving complex problems in casting. The company used the French sand casting method, which was actually an Italian method that used French sand, whose high clay content was better in holding the shape of the plasticine wax model and thereby rendering it more accurately. Remington completed his Bronco Buster in 1895 in September, shortly before his 34th birthday. His first effort was both a critical and a commercial success. And here you see one of the early castings. One reviewer praised the work as, quote, effective in form and admirably modeled with full anatomical knowledge, proving thereby that the artist is a sculptor of power, close quote. A New York Times critic added, quote, it is scarcely to be credited that this work is Mr. Remington's first attempt to model in clay. So capitally he has succeeded, and with so difficult a subject. In point of fact, it certainly shows genuine taste and talent in that direction, close quote. Similar praise attended the sculpture in reviews in Harper's Weekly, the Century magazine, and a writer for the English Art Journal, who said it was, quote, effective in form and admirably modeled. Apart from its literal veracity, the mere beauty of shape and muscle in man and beast pleases the eye, close quote. Frederic Ruckstall, the sculptor who had encouraged Remington's first foray into the medium and who also served as secretary of the National Sculptors Society, called the work, quote, the best equestrian group he had ever seen, close quote. That's coming from the National Sculptors Society, who had seen a few equestrian groups. Compliments came from the outside art world as well. One of the most significant came in 1898 from Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, the Spanish-American war hero who had led the charge on the heights above San Juan, Cuba, and who would soon become the governor of New York, the vice president of the United States, and later the president himself. On September 15th, 1898, this is 3 years after Remington completes his Bronco Buster, the Rough Riders, Roosevelt's cavalry regiment, presented its commander with a casting of the Bronco Buster. And here you see on the left, Roosevelt shaking hands with each member of his outfit as they mustered out, with Remington's Bronco Buster sitting on a table just to the rear of Roosevelt, who is in the lightest colored uniform there on the left. Roosevelt said, "I have long looked hungrily at that bronze, but to have it come to me in this precise way seemed almost too good. There could have been no more appropriate gift from such a regiment." And he was quite pleased and kept it in close to him, both at his home, or particularly at his home on Oyster Bay in Long Island. Remington bronzes were sand cast until 1900, when Remington switched foundries to the Roman bronze work in New York City, which also was a quality foundry, but employed the lost wax method of casting. We have and we will be recommending a short video of the lost wax method of casting. So I won't go through the process with you, but it's fundamentally different from the sand casting methods. But basically, it allowed Remington to have a greater control over each individual casting of his bronzes. And he reworked the waxes and clay models between almost every casting, certainly early in the process of or in the sale of his work. The lost wax method allowed Remington the opportunity to vary the texture and other elements of his work from casting to casting. The woolly shaps, for example, that are shown on this Bronco Buster in 1908 are totally different from the slick leather shaps or leggings that are shown in the casting of the Bronco Buster in the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art, shown on either side. So he could vary even those kinds of details from casting to casting. And this was not the only detail that he varied. He varied the stirrups, for example. In some cases, such as the figure on the left, the stirrups hang down. On the figure on the center, the stirrups of the saddle fly loose as the horse's or the rider's foot is slipped out of the stirrups. If you are to take a look at the quirt, you will see that its angle has been varied from the casting on either side of the center figure that you see. And also the hat, which is bent up on either side on the casting on the left, and is flat in the back and the casting in the center. This has driven collectors and people who are trying to authenticate Remington's sculpture batty because of the changes that he made, and people were looking for similarities from casting to casting, not differences. And there were others as well. He really enjoyed the opportunity to play with this work. And as I said, he reworked the surface of the model each time in order to achieve such effects. Remington sold his Bronco Buster sculpture and others of his production through Tiffany and Company in New York. About 150 casts of the Bronco Buster were produced in the artist's lifetime, and others during the life of his wife, Eva, who continued to cast additional bronzes from the foundry molds. The last one recorded in the Roman Bronze Works ledger book was the year of Eva's death in 1918, which was 214. So during the lifetime of Frederic Remington, the artist, and his wife, some 214 castings were created. And since that time, there have, of course, been thousands and tens of thousands of more. But unfortunately, only those castings that were, most of those castings that were published produced during Remington's lifetime, have the extra work that he put in to create the detail that is characterizes his best work. And this has created something of a problem because so many of the recastings were not accorded the same sort of precise detail that the artist put into each of his lifetime castings. And so have not appeared to have the sort of finesse that really Remington had in his original work. And therefore people have not, most people have not encountered really good castings of his work unless it be in a museum that happened to have one of the lifetime casts. And so they haven't seen Remington for what he really was, which was an innovator with these cantilevered forms. Yet he was, despite the artistic achievement, he wasn't without his critics. Some thought that the tuck of the rearing Bronc's front legs in the sculpture, as you see here, the front legs are drawn up, when in reality, Broncs buck with their legs straight. They don't curl them up, except perhaps maybe in a rearing position when they've been taught to do that. But as you see in this photograph by Irwin Smith of a bronc rider in action, the horse is bucking with the legs straight. Nevertheless, Remington was encouraged by the positive response for his first bronze and was soon modeling another, which was called the Wounded Bunkie, which is like your roommate, your bunkie in the military. It was a subject that featured two horses and riders at a gallop, and you'll notice that there are only 2 points of contact in the 8 legs of the two horses. That was another effort on the part of Remington to try to make his bronzes evoke movement. And by 1898, he had produced yet another group called the Wicked Pony, which you see here, featuring a cowboy thrown by a bucker, again utilizing this cantilevered form to create this beautiful half-circular composition. Again, not anybody was doing anything like this in terms of getting action into bronze. The equines in Remington's sculptures positively quiver with action. Of the 22 subjects he had modeled by 1909, after he started in 1895, almost all of them contain one or more horses. The critic Perriton Maxwell touted, quote, "every one of them unique in conception, vigorous in handling, true in detail," close quote. I've provided on the right a drawing of the outlaw with Remington standing beside it in his smock, conversing with Riccardo Bertelli of the Roman Bronze Company. And he's saying, Bertelli's saying to Remington, "Who do you think I am, the Wright brothers?" Meaning Remington was trying to evoke flight, and Bertelli was trying to cast these bronzes that were totally different from and almost could take flight. Always thought that was a wonderful little drawing, and allegedly that was Bertelli's comment. Earlier, Richard Watson Gilder, the editor of Century magazine, had written the artist quote, "I went the other day to see those ripping bronzes of yours. They are all thoroughly alive and thoroughly original, and they continue to be so." In Remington's bronzes, the equestrian form, the equine form, appears in every imaginable attitude: bucking, falling, pulling, shying, bolting. And in the case of Coming Through the Rye, completed in 1902, shown here, of these 4 riders seeming even to take flight. Here you have 4 horses and only with 16 legs, and only 4, I believe, are touching the base. This sculpture, Coming Through the Rye, was suggested by earlier illustrations, as many of his sculptures were. Illustrations like the cowboys coming to town for Christmas, painting the town red, both were done in the 1880s. But Coming Through the Rye featured, as I said, the 4 mounted figures, and that would be 6 of the 16 hooves rather than just 4, but still a magnificent achievement. So much so that the organizers of both the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904 and the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition in Portland, Oregon, the following year, placed an enlarged plaster version of the popular work, which went by the title Off the Range, in this iteration, at the entrance to the midway of both of these World's Fairs. These temporary adaptations of Remington's work were destroyed after the event, and the Coming Through the Rye was not recreated until the 1960s by the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum, which had a larger-than-life group created for the grounds of the Cowboy Museum in Oklahoma City. In 1905, the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Purchased castings of both Coming Through the Rye and the Mountain Man, a sculpture that you can see on it's third from the left in this group. The Coming Through the Rye and the Mountain Man thus became the first Remington bronzes to enter a museum collection. Later, in 1907, 4 of his bronzes, shown here, reached the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Bronco Buster, of course, Old Dragoons, Mountain Man, and the Cheyenne are all in the collection of the Met today. In 1905, Remington released his sculpture, The Rattlesnake, which is a very interesting piece that involves, again, a clever manipulation of form in order to achieve balance in the creation of this sculpture. It was based on his earlier illustration, The Right of the Road, shown on the left, which was a double-page spread in Harper's Weekly, showing a bicycle frightening a group of horses that are pulling a stagecoach, and you can see how they have lurched in kind of an ungainly way, as one who was an animal that was surprised might do. And again, the rattlesnake that's shown on the right has surprised both horse and rider, and the horse, the rattlesnake has been substituted for the bicyclist in the latter case. In the spring of 1908, Remington was invited to produce an outdoor monument for Philadelphia's Fairmount Park. And he set about creating his larger-than-life equestrian cowboy. building upon the monumental sculptural traditions dating back nearly 2 millennia. This would be his first and only monument that he would actually create. And the motif that he employed for his Bronco Buster, that of the rearing horse and rider, was quite different from those of the typical monuments of ancient art. As you see here, the very first known equestrian monument, Marcus Aurelius, shown on the left here. And then by the 1400s, the equestrian monuments had begun to appear with some regularity in Europe. The two best examples being soldiers, the Gattameleta, the Venetian mercenary, otherwise known as Erasmo di Narni, by the Italian artist Donatello, and the sculpture of Bartolomeo Caglione, the Captain General of the Republic of Venice, by Verrocchio, all shown on the left here, or pardon me, shown here. Along with the Baroque period was marked by experimentation with a bit of action in equestrian sculpture, and the sculpture of the monument to Philip the IV of Spain, which you see here, a little different, but the same kind of evoking of emotion that Remington was attempting to achieve by his cantilevered form. The engineering on the Philip IV sculpture was done by none other than Galileo, who devised a metal base built into the pedestal, which acted as a counterweight to the work, as opposed to making the work balance itself, as Remington did, which was his real achievement. U.S. artist Clark Mills created the first American equestrian monument, Andrew Jackson, in 1853. He faced similar kind of engineering problems, as did other American equestrian monuments that followed. They had to they did not have the capability of creating the exaggerated form that Remington achieved. Here is another example of an American equestrian monument, George Washington, done in 1854 by Thomas Crawford. In the last 4 decades of the 19th century and the first 2 of the 20th century, there was a intense desire to memorialize the sacrifices and heroism in the American Civil War, which prompted the commissioning of a host of equestrian monuments, most of them honoring military leaders on both sides of the conflict. I'll show you one, which is the Grant Monument in 1897. That was erected in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia, the same group that invited Remington to create his monument. This was a statue of General Ulysses S. Grant by Daniel Chester French, who did the Grant figure, and Edward Clark Potter, who teamed with French and did the horse. and that was not uncommon for two artists to collaborate, one doing the horse, one doing the rider. And this figure was dedicated in 1898, and here are a couple of views of that. The Grant Monument joined another equestrian work already in the Philadelphia Park, Fairmount Park, that of Joan of Arc, a statue commemorating the French heroine by Emmanuel Frommet. Had been cast and dedicated in 1890. The French government had originally commissioned the work, which was completed in 1874. Several earlier casts were installed in Paris, and also besides Philadelphia, in New Orleans and Portland in the United States. The year after the dedication of the Grant Memorial in Fairmount Park, Cyrus Dallon's 8-foot tall bronze medicine man was cast in Paris and exhibited at the Paris Salon and at the Exposition Universelle, where it won a gold medal. The Fairmount Park Association in Philadelphia subsequently bought and installed a casting in the park in 1903. So those were a group of equestrian sculptures already in Fairmount Park when Remington made his debut with his the cowboy. He was decided that he would portray the cowboy as on an active Western Mustang, though not a bucking horse. He explained to the Fairmount Park Commission committee that it was, quote, a good type of old Texas cowboy who came up over the trails with the cattle in the early 1880s on a small Spanish horse. In 1905, the association board visited the artist's studio to see the first plasticine, which is the sort of putty-like clay maquette of Remington's work. They were satisfied with what they saw, and the artist achieved the go-ahead on the proposed statue about the middle of January in 1906 at a cost of $20,000, which was, if one looks at the purchasing power of $20,000 in 1906, that's equivalent to over $500,000 today. The artist paused his work long enough for carpenters to build a new studio wing onto his New Rochelle, New York residence with a 17-foot ceiling and a track and a car, well, sort of like a railroad track and car, that would allow the artist to roll his model outdoors to see it in natural light, because that would be the way that it would be exhibited. Unlike other sculptors who had employed assistants on monuments, Remington did both horse and rider, and by the fall of 1906 had finished a clay model of his cowboy. Through it all, Remington labored especially hard to make his cowboy's mount distinctive. He said, quote, "I'm trying to give you a Remington Bronco." And the Bronco in Bronco Buster, and the Bronco as Remington always spelled it, and which was commonly spelled in that day with an H, B-R-O-N-C-H-O, rather than B-R-O-N-C-O, as we know it today. But he said, "I'm trying to give you a Remington Bronco and am not following the well-known recipe of sculptors for making a horse." And that accounts for this stiff-legged sort of appearance that the animal shows in its final iteration here, as the left leg struts out in a very unconventional and striking manner, but also carried out with a bold and competent technique that compels the heartiest admiration, as the association board would later say. But it did trouble at least one member of the review committee who called it inartistic. Remington, as was his practice, ignored such criticism. But he could not really ignore the fact that fellow sculptor Gutzon Borglum, who's better known for his Mount Rushmore presidential heads, had introduced a similar straight leg attitude in the bronze horse carrying General Philip Sheridan, shown here, as he rallied Union troops during the Battle of Cedar Creek. Borglum had seen Remington's model at the foundry and apparently had decided to apply this version of Remington's horse leg to his own work, which was unveiled in Washington, D.C. a few months before Remington's cowboy was. And this sort of irked Remington, but I think down deep he was probably pleased that he had impacted a fellow sculptor's work. In April, the original clay model of the cowboy was converted into a plaster mold and stored at Roman Bronze Works before finally being created and sent for unveiling on June the 20th, 1908. And here you see a rather poor photograph of the enthusiastic crowd that gathered for the unveiling in Philadelphia of the Remington's The Cowboy. There was a Wild West show in town, and so the performers were all drafted to come out and participate in the ceremonies, and that accounts for the cowboys and Indians that you see peppered around this large crowd that was on hand for the unveiling. Remington, however, was not. He didn't feel like that he needed to show up for this, and so he took a pass. But in the weeks that followed the unveiling, thousands went to the site of the monument, and many said that, or many sources say that all who saw it were moved by the sculpture. And Remington was satisfied, and particularly with his, he said, that model I knew would never look right until in place. Some more solemn and reposeful thing might defend itself in a foundry, but that cowboy had to be on a bluff that it was intended for. I hope now someone will let me do an Indian and a Plains cavalryman, and then I will be ready for glory. But Remington died unexpectedly the day after Christmas in 1909 from an appendicitis. His death came at the dawn of the automotive revolution, as the ages long usefulness of horses as transportation and beasts of burden came gradually to an end in the United States and other industrial countries. Yet the artist's work and his reputation as a delineator of the American West lived on, as did monumental equestrian sculpture, particularly in the American West, and there are a host of them out there today. Remington's reputation as a sculptor has endured the passage of time, despite the mass reproduction of recasts of his bronze without regard to quality, and his long career as an illustrator, which still colors the opinions of some art historians and critics. In 1989, for example, a pundit for the New Yorker magazine called Remington's equestrian sculptures cliched and unworthy of serious attention by a major art museum. The critic was apparently ignorant of the prominent role Remington played in creating the cliché to which the critic referred, and from the artist's days to the present, major museums from the East Coast to the West, including the Met, have bought or accepted Remington bronzes as gifts in their permanent collections. I'm showing here a casting of the Bronco Buster, which has long occupied a place near the presidential desks in the Oval Office in both Democratic and Republican administrations, beginning back around President Eisenhower's time frame. And it has been an ever-present symbol of the challenge of the office as president and the internal qualities that the leader of the free world should possess. And I think that it will probably be there a while longer. I appreciate your attention this morning, and hope that you've gained a little better appreciation for one of the greatest of American sculptors, Frederic Remington, and his Bronco Buster. And I encourage you to come to the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art and see our casting.
I do have a question for you, Byron,
Sure.
that came up in the chat. So Helen was asking, why did the Cowboys hate the sculpture that was at the World's Fair? And I believe she was talking about the plaster that you were mentioning.
The Cowboys rode with a light rein. This guy's jerking his reins until they're completely, he's exaggerating. This would have really been cruel to the horse's mouth and jaw to create the animal or to treat the animal in that way. And so that showed a lack of horsemanship on the part of the cowboy. That's and not something that those real cowboys were wanting to acknowledge. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Here you see, as you've come up the stairs into the Atkins collection gallery, you can see the Bronco Buster and appropriately the Mustang and fiberglass to the rear. This, by observing the details that Remington is using in this particular sculpture, the cowboy rides with a single cinch saddle that's set in a forward form, which was indicative of the kind of riders that appeared on the Great Plains, and not in the center fire position in the middle of the barrel of the horse, as Californians who rode with a single cinch rode in that way. This was a more three-quarter view, which would have been a Northern Plains sort of rigging. It was not the double cinch rigging of the Texas cowboys. And so if the more one knows about the clothing and equipment of the equestrian American cowboy of the late 19th century, one can really appreciate Remington's attention to detail. He certainly thought it was important. One of the interesting things about this, our casting, is that the stirrup is on a swivel, and it actually moves, and it's not locked into place, although it appears to be in this particular view.
I have another question for you, kind of related to that. So Deborah was asking, is this among the first 150 castings? Yes,
but it's in the latter portion. It's difficult to tell exactly, but Remington at one point spent less time. Although he tried to work on all of them at some point, he did not spend as much time on each casting, one to the other, and some are more detailed than others. But this is, I believe, one of the lifetime casts, but not one of the first lifetime casts.
So that just brings up a question that I have. So out of those lifetime casts, are there any that are more desirable than others, even though, he was making so many different variations?
I don't know that I think it's a personal, kind of a personal taste, and the fact that they're not exactly available. They're limited quantity. So yeah, I think you probably want to take what you could get if you could get a lifetime cast. I don't believe you would reject any of them because he was pretty particular. And the fact that he chose Tiffany's, and that Tiffany's was a typical purveyor of bronze and sculptural figures is interesting.
Definitely. We have one other question actually from Darren, who was our coffee roaster who's joined us today. He also was asking if you could clarify, and you mentioned it just for a moment, but I'm wondering if you could talk about it just a little bit more. So he mentions, so the difference in the spelling of Bronco, sometimes there's the CH and sometimes the H is left out, depending on what source you're looking at. Can you just kind of go into that a little bit more?
I have no idea. The H, certainly the Bronco comes out of the Spanish tradition, and that may have been a pronunciation, and they just may have done it phonetically. I'll need to study more on that before I'm not a linguistics expert, but it's not the usage today, but was a familiar usage back in that day. Yes, and you're right, Jerry, that cowboy was also hyphenated in some early photos. There was a lot of these things did not become standardized until somewhat later.
That's interesting. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments you'd like to add into the chat? Now's the chance.
Remington considered the Polish and Russian sculptors that preceded him to have produced the best and the most lively and active creations before he got started, but he wanted to push the envelope. But he considered those several European sculptors whose names, pardon me, I've not. I'm not great with the pronunciation of Polish and Russian names, so they'll remain anonymous for the time being. But I'll be happy to provide them to you if you're want to email me.
Well, I guess if nobody has anything else, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. So I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and don't forget to mark your calendars for next month's session. So that's featuring Paul Gauguin's Suburb Under Snow, and that will be presented by Francesca Gianni. And to really also complete that experience, our friends at Black Camel Coffee are working on a special roast called Coffee Under Snow, and that will be available for purchase on their website soon. I'm going to put the link here to register for this event into the chat, but I'll also send it out with the recording as well. So there's that.
And don't forget to look at the link for the short film that take about 5 or 6 minutes that shows the casting process, the lost wax process. That was And it'll show an actual sculpture, a monument of Theodore Roosevelt, which was done for Seattle, I believe, by Alexander Fimster Proctor, and shows the foundry processes one after the other of the lost wax method of casting, and I think you'll find it interesting. And note that Proctor was the person also who had created the sculpture that Buffalo Bill's Cowboys wanted to tear down. He was doing better by the time that he did this one, and I think you'll enjoy the seeing how the process worked.
It is definitely interesting. I've watched it. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. We hope we'll see you next time. Have a great, wonderful weekend.